As much as Hollywood absolutely loves sequels in a commercial sense, they're incredibly tricky to pull off well in practical terms, because finding a way to creatively one-up what came before just isn't that easy. But one way to ensure a sequel isn't merely a tepid retread of the first film, is to just go way harder, ensuring if nothing else, audiences will probably respect the effort and commitment. Though not all of these 10 Wild sequels are universally beloved, they get a lot of points for going hell for leather on the execution front, practically drowning the audience in ludicrous action sequences, incredible practical effects, delirious comedy, and in turn, delivering a fundamentally crazier experience. And so, with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with 10 movie sequels way crazier than the original. Number 10, Gremlins 2: The New Batch. Joe Dante's original Gremlins may be a relatively wild black comedy, but compared to its 1990 sequel, it seems positively austere. Though Warner Brothers were keen to get a sequel off the ground quickly, Dante was reluctant and only agreed to make Gremlins 2 when he was given full creative control over the project, as well as a budget thrice that of the original. The result was Gremlins 2: The New Batch, a sequel so gloriously unhinged, one can scarcely believe a major Hollywood studio actually greenlit it. Dante, who had a difficult experience making the first Gremlins, envisioned the sequel as a quasi-parody of both the original and movie sequels as a whole, upping the ante in a way that was both totally ridiculous and yet absurdly entertaining. Because it took 6 years for Warner Brothers to convince Dante to make the sequel, it unsurprisingly flopped at the box office, though has endured over the last 3+ decades as one of the most daring sequels ever produced within the Hollywood system. Number 9, Mission Impossible 2. Brian De Palma's original Mission Impossible wasn't exactly a sober and restrained spy romp, culminating as it did with the bad guy flying a helicopter into the Channel Tunnel. But Paramount evidently wanted to crank things up to 11 for the sequel, and who better for the gig than legendary action auteur John Woo, who was fresh off the deliriously entertaining Face Off. Mission Impossible 2 is ultimately a monument to shiny, stupid excess. The virus plot scarcely makes a lick of sense, but it's propped up by an abundance of loony action, with Woo being allowed to fully let his freak flag fly. It's a film that begins with Hunt climbing a rock face, which Cruise did for real, and only gets crazier from there, culminating in Ethan Hunt and villain Sean Ambrose playing chicken with motorcycles and diving into each other's arms as they fly off a ledge. Yep. Number 8, Halloween 3: Season of the Witch. Halloween 2 will forever be remembered as the sequel that introduced the wildly divisive twist that Laurie Strode and Michael Myers were siblings, but that's got nothing on the left-field insanity of the third movie. For starters, Halloween 3: Season of the Witch doesn't feature Myers at all, but rather focuses on a totally separate story as John Carpenter attempted to pivot Halloween into a horror anthology series. As a result, the story slaloms into outwardly supernatural territory, focused on a company producing Halloween masks fitted with microchips, which contain fragments of Stonehenge and will kill any children wearing them when their TV commercial airs. By comparison, Carpenter's original Halloween seems positively serene, even pedestrian, focused as it is on a masked killer slaughtering his way across a podunk town. Unsurprisingly, Season of the Witch disappointed the many fans expecting to see The Shape, though decades removed from its release, it's certainly recalled more fondly today. Number 7, Rambo: First Blood Part 2. The original Rambo film, First Blood, is an outstanding action thriller in which a PTSD-afflicted Vietnam War vet, John Rambo, finds himself on the wrong side of a sleepy town's antagonistic sheriff. Though it's certainly gut-wrenchingly suspenseful and packed with action, Rambo only actually kills a single person throughout First Blood, and the tone is surprisingly thoughtful, focused on the mistreatment of war vets in the US, topped by a genuinely brilliant Sylvester Stallone performance. Yet the sequels made it incredibly easy to forget that First Blood actually had something to say, because from its immediate sequel onwards, it devolved into the very parade of carnage the first film seemed to be rallying against. In Rambo: First Blood Part 2, the anti-war sentiment is tossed out of the window in favour of a brutal action fest where Rambo fights to rescue prisoners of war in Vietnam. The result is a film in which Rambo kills 58 people compared to the original's 1, and even that one was accidental. It couldn't fly more hilariously in the face of the first film's consideration of violence's traumatic effects, and though fun as a dumb popcorn flick, it's arguably crazier in a lot of the wrong ways. Number 6. Batman Returns. Say what you will about Warner Brothers, but they've produced some truly nutty sequels in their time, and few can match the mesmerizing gothic zaniness of Tim Burton's Batman Returns. Now, Burton's original 1989 Batman was already relatively out there, with its German expressionist-inspired art direction, rather unhinged depiction of the Bruce Wayne-Batman dichotomy, and inclusion of music by Prince. But it feels like a dead ordinary superhero movie compared to Batman Returns, which centers itself so boldly around the Penguin, a shamelessly ridiculous villain, and yet one who is both tragic and terrifying courtesy of Danny DeVito's superb performance and Burton's expert handle on tone. That's without getting into the kinkiness of Catwoman and her sizzling sexual tension with Batman. Remember, in a film marked towards children. It's perhaps the horniest family-friendly superhero film ever made, and certainly the weirdest. Its considerably darker, edgier tone put a major dent in its box office, netting almost $150 million less than the original. Yet today, many believe it to be the superior of Burton's two Batman movies. Number 5. Fast 5. Back when the original The Fast and the Furious was released in 2001, nobody would have described it as a quaint little action movie, given that it was centered around a group of criminals stealing DVD players in extremely stylish fashion. The next few sequels modestly raised the stakes, and though the fourth movie, Fast and Furious, flirted with more over-the-top action, it wasn't until Fast 5 that the series truly accelerated into another dimension. Fast 5 ultimately downplayed the series' petrolhead vibe in favour of a broader heist-actioner tone, but in turn wore the series' already frayed tether to reality down to the nub. This is the film that began to truly depict the series' family as death-defying superheroes. Fast 5's unforgettable climax, in which the heroes drag a bank vault around the streets of Rio de Janeiro, is so jaw-dropping that the series has been chasing the same high ever since. It goes without saying that the franchise has gotten even crazier in recent years, what with F9 taking the series into space for a brief foray, but Fast 5 marks the point at which it categorically said farewell to the faintest semblance of physical plausibility. Number 4. Jason X. Jason X is the crowned king of the in-space glut of horror movie sequels, and marks about as drastic a departure from the original camp-set slasher film as humanly possible. Jason X is set almost 500 years in the future, and sees Jason slaughtering a fleet of poor saps aboard a spaceship after they discover his frozen body and accidentally thaw him out. And because that's not wacky enough, it culminates in Jason being killed and then reanimated as a nanite-infused cyborg, at which point the series has strayed so far from Mrs. Voorhees killing camp counselors as to almost feel like another IP entirely. Number 3. Mad Max 2. George Miller's original Mad Max is a relatively modest, low-budget revenge thriller establishing a uniquely dystopian outback vibe, but in a way that largely feels relatively grounded. The bulk of the story sees Max attempting to stop a violent motorcycle gang and ultimately avenge the death of his wife and young son at their hands. But following the film's success, Miller received more than 10 times the budget for the sequel, which despite releasing just 2 years later, is in a whole other stratosphere. In Mad Max 2, society has completely collapsed and the remaining dregs of humanity are largely bloodthirsty primitive barbarians, with Max proving one of the rare exceptions. It's a film with villains, including the gimp-suit-wearing brute Lord Humongous and the mohawk-clad Wes. While Miller himself has stated that he only views the Mad Max movies as direct sequels in the faintest sense, given their loosey-goosey internal continuity, Mad Max 2 nevertheless injects a weapons-grade dose of insanity into the comparatively believable dystopian world of the original film. Number 2. Crank High Voltage. Now it sure does take some doing to top the dementedly balls-to-the-wall thrills of the Jason Statham starring actioner Crank, in which he plays the daftly monikered Chev Chelios, a hitman who is injected with a poison which will kill him if he doesn't keep his adrenaline flowing. Chelios seemingly died at the end of the first film, and so many were surprised when a sequel, Crank High Voltage, was announced. High Voltage, which was marketed with the tagline "He was dead, but he got better," kicks off with Chelios having his heart switched out for an artificial battery-powered one, requiring him to get continually electrically charged throughout. Crank 2 knew that the original set a high bar for the sequel to clear, and so after Chelios is resurrected, one of the first things he does is shove an oiled-up shotgun up a perp's backside. It's a sequel that aptly ends with Chelios on fire and flipping the audience off, and perhaps because this is such a struggle to one-up, the much-desired Crank 3 still hasn't happened. Number 1. Bad Boys 2. Michael Bay's original Bad Boys was certainly no slouch in the action department, though ultimately a relatively familiar, if well-crafted, buddy cop film. The film's box office success led to Sony giving Bay a stonking $130 million to produce the sequel, compared to the original's $19 million, resulting in one of the looniest live-action tentpoles of all time. Bad Boys 2 is, to be clear, a mess, but an absolutely glorious one, an overstuffed 147-minute feast of gorgeously oversaturated visuals, ridiculously juvenile humour, ultra-violent action, and hilarious banter between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. In one moment, we're watching cars being thrown across the freeway like toys, but before long, jokes are being made about attractive corpses in a morgue, and we also get to watch two rats having sex, because, well, reasons. Bay shows restraint in no aspect of the film's production, and as exhausting as it might threaten to be, it's tough not to at least begrudgingly respect Bay's go-for-broke refusal to rein things in. And that concludes our list. If you think we missed something, then do let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.